Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review, the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. Emma Watson, Florence from Florence and the Machine, and Mark Zuckerberg have all started book clubs with interesting formats, but there's none we love more here at the Book Club Review than The Happy Reader, Penguin's magazine that takes inspiration from the idea of a reading group. Their most recent edition, featuring Hollywood star Owen Wilson and Roman Emperor philosopher Marcus Aurelius, is just out, and it seemed the perfect moment to revisit our interview with the magazine's editor, Seb Emina. How does he define The Happy Reader, a magazine unlike any other?
What is The Happy Reader? We describe it a lot of the time as a magazine-shaped book club, a book club that takes the platform of a magazine for its own and sees what can happen when you use it that way. Maybe not the format of a book club so much, because it's very much a readable, linear magazine in many ways, but the spirit of a book club. It's a collaboration between Penguin, and specifically Penguin Classics, and the people behind magazines like Fantastic Man, The Gentlewoman. It's a kind of collaboration between some of the best book designers in the world, I think, Penguin Press, and some of the best magazine designers and magazine makers. Every issue has a cover star, a significant cultural figure who is also a voracious reader, an avid consumer of the written word. We interview them at length about their reading habits, and through that you can kind of get at everything about a person, I think, because if you're a big reader, then that touches on everything you do, but it also reveals so much about your life. And then the second half of the magazine, and it really is very, very conceptual in the sense, if you open the 64-page magazine, on the staple in the centre, you find a second cover, and the cover star of that half of the magazine is a book, which we call the Book of the Season. Every issue we choose one single classic work of literature, and half of the magazine is inspired by or in the orbit of this book, which is to say it's not about the book so much as almost as if the book was to come to life and become the guest editor. So it could be everything from reportage to opinion to essays about elements of history. It could be an interview with somebody else. We've had interviews with Corsican separatists and with pop stars. But every single time there's some kind of link, tenuous or direct, with the book of the season. We also have people talking about their life the first time they read it and pieces about the author, but in general the idea is that if you have read the book, then brilliant, you'll understand this strange jigsaw puzzle that we're putting together of magazine articles that use the book as their kind of centre of gravity. But if you haven't read the book, you can still enjoy the magazine. So in that sense, it's a bit like a real book club where you can go along and have a drink and enjoy the conversation, even if you've been pretty naughty and haven't actually got around to reading it. And then also at the end of the magazine, we reveal what the next book of the season will be. So the idea is that everybody's reading along.
Off the top of your head, can you go through some of the books that you've covered in The Happy Reader over the years? How long has it been going?
It's been going since 2014, so almost 3 years now, and we've done 9 issues so far. The first one we did was the sort of classic gothic thriller from the late 19th century by Wilkie Collins, The Woman in White, a real page-turner, so a perfect book for people to get started with The Happy Reader on. There's The Book of Tea by Kakuzo Okakura, which is a meditation and a treatise on the Japanese tea ceremony, but on the kind of quotidian beauty of everyday rituals in general. We had Granite Island by Dorothy Carrington from 1971, an incredible portrait of the island of Corsica. We had Émile Zola's Au Bonheur des Dames about the rise of the Parisian department store. And we had Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, probably needs no introduction. And then in the current issue, we have a bit of a blockbuster in the form of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island.
It's a very interesting and eclectic list of quite unusual titles. I love that sense. With a book club, I often think it's something that provokes you to read things that you wouldn't normally read left to your own devices, and I think The Happy Reader really sort of celebrates that.
When we choose the books, we always try and think, well, what have we done before? And what's a departure from that? What's completely different? Because you don't want to do a French 19th century fiction and then follow it up with another French 19th century fiction. You always want to change things. What I also really like doing is thinking about, well, what's going on in the world right now? Which book feels strangely relevant to what's happening in the news, what's happening in culture, these kinds of things. Sometimes we've chimed very nicely with those things. So for autumn 2016, I knew the American election was going to be happening and we'd all be completely obsessed with it. So I wanted to do an American novel, and we chose not, like most novels, a novel of the cities of New York or of DC or something, but we chose a book of the heartland of the flyover states, Willa Cather's O Pioneers. In the end, it really, really resonated with that moment. I mean, that book, which was written later than you might think in the early 20th century, but still portrays this untamed American wilderness, these pioneers out there in the face of a kind of hopelessly wild landscape, trying to carve out a life there. You sort of realize how young a country America is. That's barely 100 years ago. Much of the states, as it is now, was still completely unmapped and almost impossible to eke out a living from.
The celebrity interviews, it's a very interesting way of finding out about someone. I'm always struck by the number of recommendations that come out of that, just because in the course of that conversation, often the subject will bring up books that they've really loved, but also the interviewer will as well, and you come away sort of fizzing with ideas for things you might want to try. Have you made any discoveries through those interviews or through editing the magazine in general?
Every issue, the cover star recommends so many books that sound really great. The trouble is finding the time to look at all of them. You know, I'm still discovering things from the first issue that I finally got around to reading, one of which was Annie Dillard, Teaching a Stone to Talk, and I'd never read any of her stuff before. That collection of essays, the word essay almost is insufficient to kind of capture what they are, but there's so many amazing, vivid pieces in that book, and I probably never would have picked it up if it hadn't been for Dan Stevens talking about it.
It's beautifully produced, it's absolutely beautifully designed, and each one comes with a bookmark. It's full of gorgeous photography and it's very beautifully typeset. Is there a sense in a world where so much is disposable and online that it's important to have something that is for people to cherish and keep and to be able to page through?
It's an interesting question, because I think also the design, it feels quite flimsy in a way. We don't have a glossy cover, and the paper stock, it's beautiful, but it's designed to feel like you can read it, that you don't have to put it on your coffee table and forget about it. We had an amazing letter from somebody, he lives in Seattle, and he said he was in one of those second-hand shops, like leafing through a pile of worn-out copies of Auto Trader or National Geographic, and there was this odd, dog-eared, coffee-stained magazine that he assumed to be from the 70s or something. And then he realised that the cover star was Grimes, who's an incredibly contemporary art pop musician, and he bought it and was totally taken by the magazine. But I love these kinds of things. It makes me so excited to imagine people around the world finding the happy reader in these old piles of whatever. And he got quite lucky, because every single issue of the 8 before the current one has completely sold out and is almost impossible to find now. Some of them are going online for £300 or £400.
I realised this myself because I was looking for my old issues, because I remember I bought the first Happy Reader when it came out, and then with great pleasure I subscribed, thinking, oh, fantastic, I'll be able to get this. And so theoretically I have all of them, but I've been very casual about them. I can remember a couple I just gave away to friends, saying, oh, you're going to love this, you should have it. And then when I looked online, idly thinking, oh, maybe I can restock, I saw, sure enough, they've all gone, and I thought, oh, damn, I think I should have treated these as more precious than I did.
I think we're kind of between the two. We do really want people to read the magazine. But yes, it is so wonderfully designed between Job van Bennekom, the art director of Fantastic Man, and the team at Penguin Press, Tom Etherington and Matt Young. You've got such an elite team of designers working on it, and we really do concentrate on how it looks to the utmost degree in each issue. So I spend 2 to 3 weeks before we go to print on each issue, working really long days, scrapping loads of designs until we're confident it's just right each time. For Treasure Island, we were kind of talking about Treasure Island, what we could put in the magazine, and I got really excited about the idea of actually burying something, having a treasure map in the issue. It's really just a kind of mind-blowing idea for a magazine to break out of its pages and put something in the real world. And then it was a weird conversation, because we were like, well, what should the treasure be? I mean, we don't have budget to buy some gold coins or something. But we realised, of course, a complete set of Happy Reader back issues is actually quite a scarce commodity. So then we had this whole conversation, well, how do we bury it? And it became legally quite difficult. You can't just go into a park with a spade and a chest and bury something, because it's owned by the council, or it's owned by the National Trust or private landowner. And then the second you ask them the question, they're trying to think of why to say no to you. So it was actually quite a logistical challenge. In the end, I found an agent of sorts in Margate. I can tell you this because, as chance would have it, the treasure was finally found 7 weeks after publication on Saturday. I got an email with the code phrase 10 fathoms south of the Black Crag, which announced to me that somebody had finally discovered this treasure. It was an old tobacco tin full of nautical knickknacks taped to the back of a street sign outside a bookshop called the Old Bank in Margate, which contained the instructions to order your full Happy Reader hoard, which is the back issues plus every single past book of the season. So there's 10 books that you can read. These two guys took a day trip once they'd realised that the island question on the map, because it was a trick of scale, so the island was not a little treasure island style island, it was actually the Isle of Thanet, which is the bit of Kent where Margate and Deal and places like that are.
That's fantastic. If you were to recommend just one of the books that the Happy Reader has covered over the years to people to read, which would be your top pick?
Kakuzo Okakura is The Book of Tea. I love that book because it's a very easy book to read. It's 7 chapters, you can read it in a week. I suggested you should read it with a cup of tea each day and read 1 chapter. It's very funny, it's very profound. People I've lent it to have said, this is the best book I've ever read. They've phoned me from their sofa to tell me how much they like it. I've always had a bit of a thing for the everyday, for finding meaning in the mundane, in the things that you'd normally overlook. And for me, that book, I keep coming back to it, and I've kept writing about it in other places as well. I think with We, which all of your listeners should read and talk about in their own book clubs, it's such an amazingly poignant book for the time, I think, both in terms of being Russian. It was the first book to be banned by the Soviet Union, and it has this sort of dystopian utopia at its heart. And I think that all ties in really fascinatingly with what's happening with Silicon Valley and the sort of tech libertarian movement and what they're all obsessed with. So somehow it's at the cross-section of geopolitics and whatever our culture is doing with technology and whatever the future holds.
And Seb, are you in a book club?
Not right now. Well, apart from the Happy Reader, which to me is like a constant, permanent book club. But years ago I was in a book club based in London. I mean, I live in Paris now, but this is like 10 years ago probably. And it was 2 friends of mine. They set up a book club where each of them was allowed to invite one other person to be in the book club. And that person had to be a stranger to the other one. And then each of those people could then invite one other person, and so on until we had 10 people in the book club. So it was a kind of a string of loose acquaintances. So it was quite an interesting format, basically. I really loved it. It's a strange thing to say maybe to a book club podcast, but part of my favourite part, and maybe everyone feels like this, was the moment when you stop talking about the book and you just start talking about everything. It was kind of a social club as well. Years later, I was reading this blog post by an artist called James Bridle, and he came up with an idea called the Invisible Book Club. It would be a book club where everybody reads the book and you go out for a drink or you go out for lunch or whatever it is that you do, but you're not allowed to talk about the book. It's just that knowledge that everyone has the ideas and images and atmosphere of the book rattling around in there somewhere, somehow tinges the meeting. Something of the Invisible Book Club concept perhaps has inspired the Happy Reader, because some of these articles you're like, what the hell has this got to do with the novel I just read? But then when you think about it, you understand, you see that it's just a sentence somewhere in the middle of this 500-page novel that spirals and snowballs and becomes a whole article. And I think that's a really beautiful idea, and it's what means that anyone can read it, whether or not they've read the book of the season.
That's all for this episode. A quick recap of some of those recommendations. Seb mentioned Teaching a Stone to Talk by Annie Dillard, The Book of Tea by Kakuzo Okakura, and We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, which we also covered in episode 13 of the podcast, and which made for an excellent book club read. For more details about The Happy Reader, check their website, thehappyreader.com. If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or why not drop us a line at thebookclubreview@gmail.com and tell us about your book club. And if you're not already, do subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.